The chandelier in our dining room usually made the silverware sparkle, but tonight the light felt cold and clinical. I sat at the head of the table, looking at my husband, Julian, and my younger sister, Elena. They were laughing about an upcoming yacht trip to the Amalfi Coast, blissfully unaware that I was about to pull the rug out from under their expensive designer shoes. "I have something to tell you both," I said, my voice intentionally tight and shaky, mimicking the sound of someone on the verge of a total breakdown. They stopped laughing immediately, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that usually preceded a large check being signed. "My name is Karis Morgan. I am 34 years old, and for the last decade, I have been the sole engine driving this family's wealth. I am the CEO of Morgan Logistics, a company I built from a single van into a global empire. But tonight, I wasn't the powerful executive. I was a woman playing the role of a victim to see who would stand by me when the gold was gone. The federal investigators came to the office this morning," I whispered, leaning forward. "The accounts are frozen. I've lost everything." The silence that followed my announcement was heavy, immediate, and terrifyingly revealing. I watched the color drain from Julian's face, not out of concern for my well-being, but out of pure, unadulterated shock for his own bank account. He didn't reach for my hand or offer a word of comfort. Instead, he stood up and looked directly at my wrist. "Is that the vintage Cartier I gave you for our anniversary?" he asked, his voice losing its melodic sweetness and turning sharp and predatory. "If the government is seizing assets, they'll take that too. Give it to me. I'll keep it safe in my private locker." Before I could even process his coldness, Elena was already on her feet, heading toward the hallway where my designer handbags were stored. "I'm taking the keys to the SUV," she barked. No longer the grateful younger sister I had put through the best universities in the country. "You won't be able to afford the insurance anyway. And I need a reliable car for my social events." They didn't ask how I was feeling or if I needed a lawyer. They began stripping the house of anything valuable, treating me like a sinking ship. By the end of the first week, they had moved me out of the family estate. Julian claimed he needed to stay with his brother to process the trauma of our financial ruin, but I knew he was staying in a luxury penthouse he thought I didn't know about. They helped me move into a tiny, dilapidated apartment on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors breathing. The heater rattled like a dying engine, and the smell of old grease and damp carpet hung in the air like a thick fog. "It's all we could find on such short notice with your credit being flagged," Elena said, standing in the doorway of the cramped room with a look of pure, naked disgust. She didn't even step inside the threshold. I sat on a rickety wooden chair, looking like a woman who had lost her very soul. "Thank you, Elena," I whispered, lowering my head so she couldn't see the sharp calculation in my eyes. While they celebrated their freedom from my supposed failure, I was quietly documenting the state of the apartment and their refusal to provide basic support. The scavengers didn't stop at watches and cars. Their greed was in bottomless pit. Within 2 weeks, I discovered that Julian and Elena were selling my leftover assets, personal items I had left in the estate's climate-controlled storage, behind my back. I received silent alerts from my private security team that furniture, rare first-edition books, and even my mother's heirloom jewelry were being moved to a high-end auction house. They were liquidating my entire life to fund the lifestyle they refused to give up, even for a second. Julian even had the audacity to call me and ask where the deed to our family's summer cottage in Maine was hidden. "We need to sell it to cover the legal fees we're incurring because of your professional mess, Karis," he lied smoothly, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. I knew there were no legal fees because the investigation was a controlled simulation I had set up with my board. I told him I couldn't remember where the deed was, playing into the broken persona they expected. I listened to him curse my name under his breath before hanging up. They were stealing from a woman they believed was at her lowest. The ultimate humiliation came when Elena visited my tiny apartment with what she called a generous offer of employment. She had managed to stay on at Morgan Logistics, mostly because I had instructed my hand-picked board members to keep her in a mid-level position to see what she would do. The new management needs staff, Karis, she said, leaning against the peeling yellowed wallpaper of my kitchen. I talked them into giving you a job. It's a janitorial position on the night shift. It doesn't pay much, but at least you'll have something to do besides rot in this hole and cry. She laughed, a jagged, cruel sound that echoed in the small, empty space. She wanted to see me scrubbing the floors of the offices where I used to make million-dollar decisions that changed the industry. She wanted to walk past me with her head held high while I held a mop and wore a gray jumpsuit. I looked at her, making sure my eyes looked watery and desperate, the perfect image of a fallen queen. I'll take it, I said softly. I really need the work. The look of pure, arrogant triumph on her face was worth more than any stock dividend. I started my job as a janitor the following Monday evening, and it was a masterclass in human cruelty that I will never forget. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the monsters I had been feeding for years. Julian and Elena would intentionally spill coffee in the marble hallways just to watch me get down on my knees to clean it up. They would speak to me as if I were a mindless servant, or worse, a ghost that didn't deserve to occupy space. One afternoon, Julian called me into my old executive office, the one with the panoramic view of the skyline. Elena was sitting in my custom leather chair, spinning around with a smirk that turned my stomach. "We need you to sign these, Karis," she said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the mahogany desk. "It's just some paperwork to finalize the transfer of the remaining trust shares so we can protect them from the government's seizure." I looked at the documents and saw the trap immediately. They were backdated authorizations that would make it look like I had approved their illegal sales. I signed them without a word, knowing my attorney had replaced the originals with clever, legally binding duplicates. Arrogance reached its peak when Julian announced a rebrand gala for Morgan Logistics. He wanted to celebrate the new era of leadership, which effectively meant celebrating my public downfall and his rise to the position of acting CEO. He invited all of our former business partners, the local media, and the city's most influential political figures. He even insisted that I work the event as part of the cleaning and service crew. "It will be good for the donors to see that we're a family-first organization that doesn't just abandon people in their time of need," he said with a wink to Elena. He wanted the public to see me humiliated on the biggest stage possible. A fallen titan serving appetizers to her former peers. They spent thousands of dollars, money they had stolen from the sale of my private assets, on premium champagne, elaborate ice sculptures, and a world-class string quartet. They were so busy planning their victory lap that they didn't notice the silent moves I was making in the background with the authorities. The gala was supposed to be the funeral of my reputation, but I was ensuring it would be the birth of their permanent disgrace. The night before the gala, I met with my secret legal team in a secure, high-tech location away from the city. We went over the final mountain of evidence we had collected over the last few months. We had the crystal-clear recordings of them plotting to bleed me dry while I was supposedly broke. We had the digital trail of the illegal sales and the signed confessions from the office meeting where they tried to frame me. Most importantly, we had the proof that the company was never in any legal trouble. I had simply used a private holding company to buy up all the outstanding debt, making me the sole owner of everything they thought they were stealing from the government. "Everything is ready, Miss Morgan," my lead attorney said, handing me a clean, tailored silk suit that had been hidden away for this exact moment. "The board is standing by. The state prosecutors have the warrants. All we need is your signal." I looked at the reflection of the woman in the mirror. I didn't look like a janitor or a victim anymore. I looked like a silent chess master who had finally achieved checkmate. I felt a cold, dignified calm. The night of the gala, the ballroom of the Grand Hotel glittered with crystal lights and expensive fabric. I was there, dressed in my ill-fitting, scratchy janitor's uniform, carrying a heavy tray of empty champagne glasses through the crowded room. I watched as Julian took the stage, looking every bit the successful, charismatic CEO he never actually was. He began a long, rehearsed speech about resilience and overcoming the failures of the past. He even made a subtle mocking reference to me, pointing toward the back of the room where I stood with my head down, pretending to be invisible. Sometimes, the biggest obstacles to our success are the people we trust the most, he said with a sigh. And the crowd of socialites chuckled softly. Elena was standing in the front row wearing a diamond necklace she had saved from my private collection. She looked radiant, fueled by the satisfaction of having survived my ruin without losing a single ounce of her status. They forced me to walk through the crowd and serve drinks to the very people who used to ask me for business advice. I did it with a humble smile, waiting for the clock to strike 10. The turning tide began with the arrival of a man named Mr. Vance, a legendary investor whose backing could make or break any international company. Julian and Elena rushed to greet him, their faces glowing with desperate, oily ambition. They tried to lead him toward the VIP lounge for a private photo op, but Mr. Vance stopped in his tracks and looked around the room with a frown. "I'm not here to talk to the new leadership, as you call it," Vance said loudly, his voice cutting through the classical music like a knife. "I'm here to see the woman who actually built this empire from the ground up." The room went silent, as if someone had sucked the air out of it. Julian laughed nervously, his hand trembling as he adjusted his tie. "Oh, you must mean our former CEO, Caris? She's currently on our maintenance staff. It's a very sad story of mental decline and financial ruin, really." Mr. Vance didn't laugh or offer sympathy. He walked straight past Julian, and Elena headed toward the back of the room and stopped in front of me. He bowed his head slightly in respect. "It's time, isn't it, Caris?" he asked. I set the heavy tray of glasses down on a nearby table with a deliberate, loud clink. "Yes, it is, Arthur," I said, my voice no longer a shaky whisper but a clear, resonant tone that carried across the ballroom. I stood up straight, shedding the janitor persona like a dead skin I was tired of wearing. The guests began to whisper frantically, sensing that the script they had been told was about to change in a very dramatic and public way. I walked toward the stage with the confidence of a woman who owned the building. Julian tried to block my path, his face twisted in a mixture of confusion and boiling anger. "What are you doing? Get back to the kitchen before I have you arrested for trespassing," he hissed, his eyes darting around the room. I didn't even look at him as I brushed past. I stepped onto the podium and took the microphone from his shaking hand. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "My husband has spent the last few minutes talking to you about resilience. I'd like to talk to you about the price of betrayal." I signaled to the tech booth, the same crew I had paid triple to follow my secret instructions for the night. The massive screens that had been showing photos of Julian's charity work suddenly flickered and changed to a stark black-and-white video feed. They showed the high-definition footage from my dilapidated apartment. The guests watched in horror as Elena and Julian mocked my poverty, laughed about stealing my mother's jewelry, and discussed how they were going to trash the Morgan name to build their own separate accounts. The mask of the caring family didn't just slip. It was incinerated in front of the entire city's elite. The evidence drop continued as a series of financial documents appeared on the screen. It was a line-by-line accounting of every asset they had sold illegally, matched with the dates they had lied to me about legal fees. The signed confessions from the office were projected next, highlighting the sections where they admitted to defrauding the trust. Gasps filled the ballroom like a physical wave. People who had been laughing with Julian moments ago now stepped back from him as if he were a poisonous snake. I stood there, watching them finally see the truth. I looked at my husband, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and sweat. "The company was never seized by the government, Julian," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing through the hall like a judgment. "I simply moved the assets to a private holding company to see what you would do if you thought I had nothing left to give you. I conducted a loyalty audit on my own life. I pulled a legal document from my jacket pocket, the real deed to the company and the proof of ownership. I didn't lose my position. I just took a leave of absence to see who the real vultures were. And I'm afraid you both failed spectacularly." I turned to the board members sitting in the front row, who were already nodding in agreement. Effective immediately, Julian and Elena are terminated from any and all associations with Morgan Logistics. Their access to the accounts and properties has been permanently revoked. The rebrand gala had indeed marked a new era, but it was one where they no longer had a seat at the table. I watched as the reality of their situation set in. They were now the ones with nothing. The fallout was immediate, cold, and devastatingly efficient. As I finished my statement, the side doors of the ballroom opened, and several uniformed officers from the white-collar crime unit entered the hall. They weren't there for the party or the champagne. They walked straight to the stage and intercepted Julian and Elena as they tried to slip away through the service entrance. They were being arrested for the illegal sale of trust assets and conspiracy to commit multi-million-dollar fraud, charges backed by the very documents they had signed in my office. The guests watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence as my family was led out in handcuffs, their expensive clothes and stolen jewelry now looking like a mockery of the people they truly were. The professional distancing began before they even reached the police cars waiting outside. People were already deleting their contact information and pretending they barely knew them. I stood on the stage, watching the heavy doors close behind them for the last time. I felt no rage, only a profound sense of clarity. They had treated my life like a game of chess, but they forgot that I was the one who taught them how to play. 3 weeks after the gala, I sat in my old, the one Elena had occupied so arrogantly for a brief, shining moment. The mahogany desk was clean, the air was fresh, and the view of the city was as bright as it had ever been. My phone buzzed on the desk, a collect call from the county jail. It was Julian. I picked it up, but I didn't say a single word. I simply listened to him crying, a messy, desperate sound of a man who had lost his leverage. "Chris, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking. "We're family. You can't let us stay in this place. It was all a misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect the legacy." I looked at a photo on my desk of the 3 of us years ago, before the greed had completely rotted their hearts. "You didn't want to protect the legacy, Julian," I said calmly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You wanted to thrive on my corpse. You mistook my silence for weakness, but it was actually your countdown." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I hung up the phone and blocked the number forever. The broken provider was gone. I went back to work, finally free.